The ink of our last book had scarcely dried before we found ourselves immersed once more in the tempestuous seas of that most sovereign of human emotions, love. And as our narrative vessel sails forward, I see the charts for our next book are destined for even deeper, more turbulent waters within that very same heart. It seems fate, or perhaps the very nature of our tale, has decreed it. Therefore, before we plunge headlong into the next act of human folly and feeling, let us pause here on this philosophical shore to arm ourselves against a most peculiar and arid school of thought. We must examine that modern doctrine sprouted from the gardens of certain self-proclaimed intellectuals who, amidst a harvest of other wondrous discoveries, pretend to have unearthed the grand secret that no such passion as love resides within the human breast. Now pray tell, are these the same intellectual giants whom the late great Doctor Swift honored with his satirical pen? Those who, with the sheer unassisted force of their own genius, untouched by learning, untainted by even the simple act of reading, stumbled upon the profound and invaluable secret that there is no God? Or are they perhaps brethren to that other alarming sect who some years past sent tremors through the foundations of society by proving to their own satisfaction that no such things as virtue or goodness truly exist in the crooked timber of humanity? They who would trace the font of a mother's sacrifice or a soldier's courage back to the murky wells of pride, I shall not here presume to pin the medal of their discovery solely to one breast over another. In truth, a suspicion dark and coiled lingers in my mind that all these various finders of truth are in fact identical to those who are by others called the finders of gold. The method employed in both these noble quests for truth and for treasure is one and the same. It is the searching, the rummaging, the meticulous examining of a nasty place. Indeed, in the case of the former, they examine the nastiest place of all a bad mind. But while the truth finder and the gold finder may be compared in their method and perhaps in their ultimate success in the virtue of modesty, surely there can be no comparison between the two. For has anyone ever heard of a gold finder, his hands empty and his face smeared with the grime of a fruitless dig, having the impudence or the sheer folly to assert from his own ill success that there was no such thing as gold in the entire world? Yet the truth finder, having raked out the jakes of his own mind, and being capable of tracing no single ray of divinity nor anything virtuous, good, lovely, or loving very fairly, honestly, and with a chilling logic, concludes that no such things exist in the whole of God's creation. To avoid, however, all contention, if such a thing is possible with these philosophers, if they will indeed be called so, and to show my own disposition to accommodate matters peaceably, I shall here make them some concessions. Perhaps this act of good faith may finally lay the dispute to rest. First, I willingly grant that many minds, and perhaps those of the philosophers themselves, are entirely free from the least traces of such a passion. Their hearts are like stone gardens, beautiful in their order, but where no flower of affection blooms. Secondly, I concede that what is commonly and so loosely called love in the bawdy houses and taverns of the world, namely, the mere desire of satisfying a voracious appetite with a certain quantity of delicate white, human flesh, is by no means the passion for which I here contend. This is indeed more properly named hunger, a biological imperative, and as no glutton is ashamed to apply the word love to his appetite and to say he loves a particular dish of venison, so may the lover of this kind with equal propriety say he hungers after a particular woman. Have you encountered such characters in your own life? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thirdly, I will grant, and I believe this shall be a most acceptable concession, that this love for which I am an advocate, though it satisfies itself in a much more delicate and soulful manner, doth nevertheless seek its own satisfaction as much as the grossest of all our appetites. It is a hunger of the spirit, but a hunger none the less. And lastly, let it be known that this love, when it operates towards one of a different sex, is very apt, towards its complete gratification, to call in the aid of that baser hunger I have mentioned above. And this carnal ally is so far from abating the purer passion that it heightens all its delights to a degree scarce imaginable by those poor souls who have never been susceptible of any other emotions than what have proceeded from appetite alone. It is the difference between hearing a single clear note on a flute and being swept away by the full majestic symphony of an orchestra. In return for all these concessions, I desire but one thing from the philosophers. Grant me this, that there is in some, I verily believe in many human breasts, a kind and benevolent disposition, a gentle fire that is gratified not by taking, but by contributing to the happiness of others. That in this gratification alone, as in the steady warmth of friendship, in the fierce protective current of parental and filial affection, as indeed in the broad sunlight of general philanthropy, there resides a great and exquisite delight, that if we will not call such a disposition love, then we have no name for it in any language, that though the pleasures arising from such pure love may be heightened and sweetened by the assistance of amorous desires, yet the former can, and often does, subsist alone. It is not destroyed by the intervention of the latter, but can stand proud and independent. Lastly, that esteem and gratitude are the proper, the only, durable motives to this love, just as youth and beauty are the kindling for desire. Therefore, though such desire may naturally cease, when age or sickness overtakes its object like a fire consuming its own fuel, these cruel ravages of time can have no effect on true love. They cannot shake or remove from a good mind that sensation or passion which hath gratitude and esteem for its unshakable foundation. To deny the existence of a passion of which we see manifest shining instances every day seems not only strange, but profoundly absurd. It can indeed proceed only from that self-admonition we have mentioned above the examination of a barren heart. But how unfair, how blindingly arrogant is this line of reasoning. Does the man who recognizes in his own heart no traces of avarice or ambition, therefore conclude with finality that there are no such passions in the whole of human nature? Why will we not modestly observe the same rule in judging of the good in others as we do the evil? Or why, in any case, will we as the immortal Shakespeare so perfectly phrases, it put the world in our own person. I am afraid predominant vanity is too much concerned here. This is but one instance of the sweet, intoxicating adulation which we so lavishly bestow upon our own minds, a practice that is almost universal. For there is scarce any man, how much soever he may despise the character of a flatterer in court, who will not condescend in the meanest manner to flatter himself in the quiet chambers of his own soul. If you're enjoying this journey into the heart of human nature, please do subscribe for the next chapter of Tom Jones's adventures. Therefore, I do not apply to these philosophers for the verification of my claims. Instead, I turn to you. I apply to those whose own minds and hearts can bear witness to the truth of what I have advanced. Examine your own heart, my good reader. I implore you, look past the noise of daily life and resolve within yourself whether you do in your quietest moments believe these matters with me. If you do, if you have felt this flame, however faintly, then you are prepared. You may now proceed with a sympathetic heart to see these truths exemplified in the follies and triumphs of the characters in the following pages. But if you do not, if your heart is a stranger to these sentiments, then you have, I assure you, already read more than you have truly understood. It would be far wiser for you to pursue your business or your pleasures such as they are, than to throw away any more of your precious time in reading what you can neither taste nor comprehend. To treat of the effects of love to you would be as absurd as to discourse on the color scarlet to a man born blind. For possibly your idea of love is as absurd as the notion we are told such a blind man once entertained of that very color, that scarlet seemed to him to be very much like the sound of a trumpet, and love, in your opinion, may very greatly resemble nothing more than a dish of soup or a sirloin of roast beef. The question is, are you content with that? Or do you dare to believe there might be a grander feast for the soul? The reader hath already witnessed the procession. Mr. They, W. Western, his sister, his daughter, the young Jones, and the good parson, returning to the squire's house, a tapestry of contrasting human emotions against the fading English countryside. There the greater part of the company did indeed spend the evening wrapped in a cocoon of joy and festivity. The fire crackled with a merry rhythm, the ale flowed like a golden river, and laughter echoed off the oak-panelled walls. Yet in the heart of this warmth, Sophia sat as a statue of ice amidst the flames. For while Jones, now utterly possessed by the god of love, was further elevated by the pleasing reflection on Mr. Allworthy's recovery and the intoxicating stolen glances from his mistress, glances that sent jolts of lightning through his veins, so that he laughed and revelled with the others, Sophia remained an island of silence. She was the sole grave person, her heart a heavy anchor dragging in the sea of their mirth. This uncharacteristic gravity clung to her the next morning like a stubborn mist. At breakfast, she moved through the ritual with a ghost's presence, her replies monosyllabic, her eyes fixed on some unseen sorrow. She retired earlier than usual, leaving the stormy weather of her soul behind in the dining room, where her father and her aunt sat together, one blissfully unaware, the other sharpening her claws of observation. The squire, to be fair, took no notice of this seismic shift in his daughter's disposition, though he fancied himself something of a country politician, having twice thrown his hat in the electoral ring. He was a man who observed the world through a blunt lens, missing the subtle play of light and shadow upon the human heart. His sister, however, was cut from a different, far more intricate cloth. She had breathed the perfumed air of the court and had seen the world in all its gilded hypocrisy. Hence she had acquired all that knowledge which the said world usually communicates. She was a veritable archivist of manners, customs, ceremonies, and fashions. Her erudition did not stop at the ballroom door. She had fortified her mind with the ramparts of study. She had devoured all the modern plays, operas, and romances, pronouncing her critiques with the authority of a monarch. She had marched through Rapin's History of England and Eachard's Roman History, and navigated the treacherous waters of French memoir. To these, she had added a diet of political pamphlets, attaining a skill in politics that allowed her to discourse very learnedly on the affairs of Europe, much to the chagrin of her brother. Moreover, she was a grandmaster in the doctrine of amour. She knew the secret maps of the heart, who was charting a course towards whom. This knowledge came easily, for her own heart had never been a battlefield. Either she had no inclinations, or they had never been solicited, the latter being the more probable theory. Her formidable near 6-foot frame, crowned by her formidable manner and learning, had likely caused the other sex to regard her petticoats, notwithstanding, not as a woman to be wooed, but as a fortress to be avoided. Yet, having considered the matter scientifically, she knew all the arts of encouragement and concealment, the entire lexicon of smiles, ogles, and glances practiced in the beau monde. In short, no species of disguise had escaped her notice. But as for the plain, simple workings of honest nature, having never seen them, she was as a blind woman to their beauty. It was with this wonderful, if cynical, sagacity that Mrs. Western now believed she had made a grand discovery in the mind of her niece. The seed was planted on the field of battle, and the suspicion was corroborated by her observations that evening and the next morning. Yet, being a cautious general, she carried the secret for a full fortnight, launching only oblique hints, a simper here, a nod there, an obscure word dropped like a poison pellet, which sufficiently alarmed the sensitive Sophia, but bounced harmlessly off the thick hide of her brother. What do you think of Mrs. Western's powers of observation? Are they accurate or entirely misguided? Let us know in the comments. Finally, thoroughly satisfied of her truth, she chose her moment one morning, interrupting one of his rustic whistles. "Pray, brother," she began, a sly smile playing on her lips, "have you not observed something very extraordinary in my niece lately?" "No, not," I answered, Western, his whistle dying. "Is anything the matter with the girl? I think there is," she replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And something of much consequence, too." "Why, she doth not complain of anything," cried Western, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "And she hath had the smallpox, brother," she returned with the patience of one explaining arithmetic to a child. "Girls are liable to other distempers besides the smallpox, and sometimes possibly to much worse." Here Western interrupted her with a burst of earnest fear, begging her to acquaint him immediately if anything ailed his daughter. "She knew I loved her more than my own soul," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, and that I would send to the world's end for the best physician to her. Nay, nay, she answered, the smile returning. The distemper is not so terrible, but I believe, brother, you are convinced I know the world, and I promise you I was never more deceived in my life if my niece be not most desperately in love. The transformation in Western was instantaneous and volcanic. How in love he roared, passion darkening his face. In love without acquainting me, I'll disinherit her. I'll turn her out of doors, stark naked without a farthing. Is all my kindness for her, and fondness o'er her come to this, to fall in love without asking me leave? But you will not, answered Mrs. Western, a masterful chess player, turn this daughter whom you love better than your own soul out of doors before you know whether you shall approve her choice. Suppose she should have fixed on the very person whom you yourself would wish. I hope you would not be angry. Then the squire's temper vanished as quickly as it came. No, no, he cried, that would make a difference. If she marries the man, I would ha her. She may love whom she pleases. I shan't trouble my head about that. That is spoken, she answered, like a sensible man. But I believe the very person she hath chosen would be the very person you would choose for her. I will disclaim all knowledge of the world if it is not so. Why? Lookie's sister said, Western, I do believe you have as much as any woman, and to be sure those are women's matters. You know I don't love to hear you talk about politics. They belong to us, and petticoats should not meddle. But come, who is the man? Mary said, she savouring her victory. You may find him out yourself if you please. You who are so great a politician can be at no great loss. The judgment which can penetrate into the cabinets of princes must surely with very little difficulty find out what passes in the rude, uninformed mind of a girl. This courtly gibberish was a red rag to the bull, sister, cried the squire. I have often warned you not to talk the court gibberish to me. I know very well what is meant by that, and that our affairs don't go so well as they should do because of bribery and corruption. I pity your country ignorance from my heart, cries the lady, her own temper rising. Do you, answered Western, and I pity your town learning. I had rather be anything than a courtier and a Presbyterian and a Hanoverian too, as some people I believe are. The argument devolved into a spectacular clash of worldviews, ending with the squire threatening a flick, a whip, and the lady declaring him a clown and a blockhead, vowing to leave his house. Now the squire, though no reader of Machiavel, was a natural politician in matters of land and money. He knew the exact value of his sister's fortune and the chance of inheriting it. This was far too precious to sacrifice to a trifling resentment, and so the reconciliation began. He first corralled the horses his sister had tried to flee on, then applied himself to softening her with apologies directly contrary to what had incensed her. Lastly, he summoned the eloquence of Sophia, whose graceful and winning address, fueled by her own desperate need to calm the waters, worked wonders on her aunt. The result was a kind smile from Mrs. Western, who said, Brother, you are absolutely a perfect Croat, but as those have their use in the army of the Empress Queen, so you likewise have some good in you. I will therefore once more sign a treaty of peace with you, and see that you do not infringe it on your side, at least as you are so excellent a politician. I may expect you will keep your leagues like the French, till your interest calls upon you to break them. The plot is thickening dangerously for Sophia and Jones. Don't miss the next dramatic installment. Subscribe Now, to see if their love can survive, the squire, his heart pounding with the crude triumph of a deal well struck, was so violently impatient to communicate the proposal to Allworthy that Mrs. Western had the utmost difficulty in restraining him from bursting into the gentleman's sick chamber. He was like a hound, straining at the leash, already tasting the victory of joined estates. As fortune would have it, Mr. Allworthy had been engaged to dine with Mr. Western on the very day he was taken ill. No sooner was he discharged from the custody of physic, the taste of bitter medicine still on his tongue, than he thought, as was his invariable habit, in matters both high and low, of fulfilling his obligation. His honour was his compass, and it pointed unerringly towards Western's manor in the tense interval between the familial treaty and this day of public entertainment. Sophia's mind had been a whirlwind from the obscure hints dropped by her aunt, hints that fell like stones into the still pool of her secret. She had collected a terrifying apprehension. The sagacious lady she feared had unearthed the buried treasure of her passion for Jones. Her heart, a fragile bird, fluttered in a cage of fear, and so she resolved upon a desperate stratagem. She would use this very gathering to wipe away all suspicion, to build a fortress of deception around her true feelings. For that purpose, she would put an entire constraint upon her behavior, becoming the lead actor in a play of her own torment. First, she endeavored to cloak her throbbing melancholy heart with the most dazzling sprightliness. She painted a smile on her face that did not reach her eyes, a brilliant but empty facade. Secondly, she directed the entire cannonade of her discourse towards Mr. Blifil, a performance of such focused attention it was dizzying, and most cruelly she took not the least notice of poor Jones the entire day. Each ignored glance was a dagger she twisted in her own soul, and every peal of manufactured laughter towards Blifil felt like a betrayal of her own heart. The squire was so deliriously delighted with this conduct that he scarce ate a bite of dinner. He spent the entire time conveying his approbation to his sister through a frantic semaphore of winks, and nods his face a grotesque mask of self-congratulation. Mrs. Western, however, was not initially so pleased. A master of art suspects art in others. In short, Sophia so greatly overacted her part that her aunt was at first staggered. The performance was too perfect, the gaiety too excessive. It was like a sun too bright to be real. She began to suspect affectation, but being a woman of great art herself, she soon attributed this to extreme art in Sophia. She remembered her own many hints, and imagined the young lady was attempting to rally her, to mock her out of her opinion by this overacted civility. It was a notion that would have been better founded had Sophia been a jaded London socialite well versed in the bloody sport of emotional fencing, rather than a girl whose heart beat with the honest, untutored rhythm of the countryside. Do you think Sophia's plan is clever or a disastrous mistake? Share your prediction in the comments. In discovering the deceit of others, it matters greatly that our own art is wound up, so to speak, in the same key. For very artful men sometimes miscarry by fancying others wiser, or in other words, greater knaves than they really are. This is a deep observation, and I shall illustrate it with a tale. 3 countrymen were pursuing a Wiltshire thief through the town of Brentford. The simplest of them, seeing the Wiltshire house written on a sign, advised his companions to enter, for there they would most likely find their countrymen. The second, who was wiser, laughed at this simplicity, but the third, who was wiser, still said, "Let us go in, however, for he may think we should not suspect him of going amongst his own countrymen." Accordingly, they spent a fruitless hour searching the inn, and by that means missed the thief, who was at that time just ahead of them. They had all known, but never once reflected, that the man they pursued could not read. Thus the superior cunning of the third man led them all astray. This digression communicates an invaluable secret, and it accounts for the deceit which Sophia perhaps unknowingly put upon her politic aunt, Mrs. Western. Her mind, a labyrinth of complex motives, could not conceive of a deception so simple, so desperately transparent. Dinner being ended, and the company retired into the garden, where the sunlight dappled through the leaves, Mr. Weston, thoroughly convinced of the certainty of his sister's theory, took Mr. Allworthy aside. With his customary bluntness, he launched the proposal for a match between Sophia and young Mr. Blifil. Mr. Allworthy was not a man whose heart fluttered at the sudden tidings of worldly profit. His mind was tempered with a philosophy that became both a man and a Christian. He did not affect a stoic superiority to all joy and grief, but he was not to be ruffled by every accidental blast of fortune. He received Weston's proposal without any visible emotion, his countenance a placid lake, undisturbed by the stone thrown into it. He said the alliance was one he sincerely wished for, then launched into a just and heartfelt encomium on the young lady's merit. He acknowledged the offer was advantageous in fortune, and after thanking Weston for his good opinion, concluded with a clause of paramount importance: if the young people liked each other, he should be very desirous to complete the Spraits affair. Weston was a little disappointed. This was not the rapturous, immediate acceptance he had envisioned. He treated the doubt about the young people's mutual liking with great contempt. That parents were the best judges of proper matches for their children, he blustered. For his part, he should insist on the most resigned obedience from his daughter, and if any young fellow could refuse such a bedfellow, he was his humble servant, and hoped there was no harm done. Allworthy endeavored to soften this resentment with more praise of Sophia, but it was ineffectual. He could obtain no other answer from the squire but a sullen, "I say no more. I humbly hope there's no harm done. That's all the refrain," he repeated like a grinding stone until they parted. Allworthy, knowing his neighbour well, was not offended, and though he was averse to the rigour some parents exercise in marriage, having resolved never to force his nephew's inclinations, he was nevertheless much pleased with the prospect of this union. The whole country resounded with the praises of Sophia, and he himself had greatly admired the uncommon endowments of her mind and person, to which I believe we may add the consideration of her vast fortune. Though he was too sober to be intoxicated by it, he was too sensible to despise it. This story is a masterclass in character and society. If you're appreciating the depth, please like and share this chapter with a fellow literature lover. And here, in defiance of all the barking critics in the world, I must digress on the subject of true wisdom, of which Mr. Allworthy was as great a pattern as he was of goodness. True wisdom, despite what any poor poet may write against riches, or any well-fed divine may preach against pleasure, consists not in the contempt of either. A man may have as much wisdom in the possession of an affluent fortune as any beggar in the streets. He may enjoy a handsome wife or a hearty friend, and remain as wise as any sour recluse who starves his belly while he lashes his back. The wisest man is in fact the likeliest to possess all worldly blessings in an eminent degree, for the moderation that wisdom prescribes is the surest path to useful wealth, and it alone qualifies us to taste many pleasures without being enslaved by them. The wise man gratifies every appetite and every passion in its due season, while the fool sacrifices all the rest to pall and satiate one. If you object that wise men have been avaricious, I answer they were not wise in that instance. If you say the wisest have been immoderate in youth, I answer they were not wise then. Wisdom, in short, only teaches us to extend a simple maxim known even in the lowest life a little farther, not to buy at too dear a price. Whoever takes this maxim into the grand market of the world and applies it to honors, riches, and pleasures is a wise man in the worldly sense, for he makes the best bargains, purchasing everything at the price of a little trouble, and carries home all the good things while he keeps his health, his innocence, and his reputation, the common prices paid by others intact. From this moderation, he learns two final lessons: never to be intoxicated by a good bargain, nor dejected when the market is empty. But I must remember my subject, and not trespass further on your patience. Therefore I put an end to the chapter. The moment Mr. Allworthy returned to the hallowed halls of his own estate, a sanctuary of reason after the storm of Western's bluster, he summoned his nephew Mr. Blifil into his private study. The room, lined with the solemn faces of leather-bound books, seemed the appropriate place for a discussion of such grave and future-altering consequence. After a brief preface in which he commended the family they were about to treat with, he communicated the proposal made by Mr. Western, his voice calm and measured. He did not forget to infuse his tone with a warmth of personal approval, informing the young man how entirely agreeable this match would be to himself. Now, the truth which must be dragged into the light like a shameful secret was that the charms of Sophia, her luminous eyes, her gentle spirit, her intelligent grace, had not made the least impression on Blifil. It was not that his heart was pre-engaged elsewhere. It lay in his chest like a sterile stone, nor was he totally insensible to beauty, or harbored some strange aversion to women. But his appetites were, by nature, so moderate, so desiccated, that he was able, by a philosophy of self-interest, to easily subdue any flicker of desire. And as for that grand tumultuous passion we have treated of at the beginning of this history, he had not the least tincture of it in his whole composition. His blood was ice water, but though he was entirely free from that mixed and noble passion of which the virtues and beauty of Sophia formed so notable an object, his soul was not empty. It was altogether as well furnished with other darker passions that promised themselves very full gratification in the young lady's fortune. 2 sovereigns divided the dominion of his mind between them, avarice and ambition. He had on more than one solitary night considered the possession of this fortune as a very desirable thing, a key to a future of power and influence. He had entertained distant views like a general surveying a map of a territory he hoped one day to conquer. But his own youth, that of the young lady, and most materially, the chilling reflection that the robust Mr. Western might marry again and produce a male heir had restrained him from any hasty or eager pursuit. He was a spider waiting in the center of his web. This last and most formidable objection was now in great measure removed. The proposal came from the squire himself, a signal that the prize was not only within reach, but being offered freely. Blifil therefore, after a performance of very short hesitation, a pantomime of contemplation for his uncle's benefit, answered Mr. Allworthy that matrimony was a subject on which he had not yet bestowed much thought. But then, layering his voice with unctuous deference, he declared he was so profoundly sensible of his uncle's friendly and fatherly care that he should in all things submit himself to his pleasure. It was a response of perfect, calculated submission. Allworthy, it must be remembered, was naturally a man of spirit. His present gravity was born of experience and true wisdom, not from any original phlegm in his disposition. In his youth he had possessed much fire and had married for love for a beautiful woman who had captured his very soul. He was therefore not greatly pleased with this cold, bloodless answer. A father or a guardian hopes to see a spark of genuine excitement. In such a moment, he could not help launching forth once more into the praises of Sophia, his voice tinged with a faint wonder, expressing his surprise that the heart of a young man could be so impregnable to the force of such radiant charms, unless it was guarded by some prior secret affection. What is your opinion of Blifil's character? Is he coldly, rational, or simply wicked? Join the discussion below. Blifil was prepared for this. He assured his uncle he was guarded by no such prior attachment. Then he proceeded to discourse so wisely and so religiously on love and marriage, speaking of it not as a union of hearts, but as a solemn institution for the propagation of virtue and the consolidation of earthly estates, that he would have stopped the mouth of a parent much less devoutly inclined than his uncle. He painted a picture of such sober, rational partnership that all romance was stripped from it, leaving only the dry bones of duty. In the end, the good man's innate decency was his undoing. He convinced himself that his nephew, far from having any objections to Sophia, possessed that high esteem for her which in sober and virtuous minds is the sure foundation of friendship and love. He soothed his own unease with the thought that the lover's initial reserve would, in a little time, melt into warmth and become altogether as agreeable to his mistress. He foresaw with a hopeful heart great happiness arising to all parties by so proper and desirable an union. It was a tragic miscalculation, born of a good heart, trying to comprehend a calculated one. With Mr. Blifil's consent, therefore, he wrote the next morning to Mr. Western. The letter was all politeness and acceptance, acquainting the squire that his nephew had very thankfully and gladly received the proposal, and would be ready to wait on the young lady whenever she should be pleased to accept his visit. Western was much pleased with this letter. His pleasure was a simple, explosive thing. He did not trouble himself with the nuances of phrasing or the art of delayed gratification. He immediately scrawled a return answer, and without having mentioned a single word to his daughter, appointed that very afternoon for opening the scene of courtship. He was like a man setting two prized hounds on a hunt with no thought for the feelings of the quarry. As soon as he had dispatched this messenger, he went in quest of his sister. He found her in the drawing room, holding court. She was reading and expounding the latest issue of the Gazette to the captive audience of Parson Supple, who nodded along with a look of pained attentiveness to this political exposition Western was obliged to attend for near a quarter of an hour. It was an agony of impatience for him, his foot tapping a frantic rhythm on the floor, his fingers drumming on the table. He was a volcano struggling not to erupt. At length, he found a crack in her monologue. "Sister, I have business of great consequence to impart to you," he burst out, unable to contain himself a moment longer. To which she answered with a magnanimous sweep of her hand, "Brother, I am entirely at your service. Things look so well in the north that I was never in a better humor." The tides of European politics had smiled upon her, and thus she would smile upon him. The parson, seizing his chance, withdrew with the relief of a reprieved man. Western then acquainted his sister with all which had passed, the words tumbling out in an excited jumble. He desired her to communicate the affair to Sophia, a task she readily and cheerfully undertook. Perhaps her brother was a little obliged to that agreeable northern aspect which had so delighted her, for he heard no critical comment on his hasty, violent proceedings. For once the winds of war had blown in his favor. The net is closing in on poor Sophia. To make sure you don't miss the moment she finds out, be sure to subscribe. Sophia was in the sanctuary of her chamber, the morning light spilling across the page of her book, offering a temporary escape from the prison of her own thoughts. It was in this fragile peace that her aunt found her. The moment Sophia saw Mrs. Western fill the doorway, a silhouette of imposing expectation, she shut the book with a guilty start, a reflex of a heart that had too much to hide. The good lady's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. She could not forbear asking, her voice a delicate trap, "What book is that which you seem so much afraid of showing?" "Upon my word, madam," answered Sophia, her voice a little too steady, "it is a book which I have read. It is the production of a young lady of fashion, whose good understanding I think doth honor to her sex, and whose good heart is an honor to human nature. Her defense was a fortress hastily built." Mrs. Western then took up the book, her fingers touching the cover as if it might be contaminated. She glanced at it and immediately threw it down, a gesture of supreme dismissal. "Yes, the author is of a very good family, but she is not much among people one knows. I have never read it, for the best judges say there is not much in it." "I dare not, madam, set up my own opinion," says Sophia, with a humility that cost her effort against the best judges. "But there appears to me a great deal of human nature in it, and in many parts so much true tenderness and delicacy that it hath cost me many a tear." "Aye, and do you love to cry then?" says the aunt, a sly, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I love a tender sensation," answered the niece, her spirit flickering, and would pay the price of a tear for it at any time. "Well, but show me," said the aunt, moving in for the kill. "What was you reading when I came in? There was something very tender in that, I believe, and very loving too." You blush, my dear Sophia. Ah, child, you should read books which would teach you a little hypocrisy, which would instruct you how to hide your thoughts a little better. The words were velvet, but the intent was iron. I hope, madam, answered Sophia, her cheeks indeed burning. I have no thoughts which I ought to be ashamed of discovering. Ashamed? No, cries the aunt. I don't think you have any thoughts which you ought to be ashamed of. And yet, child, you blushed just now when I mentioned the word loving. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Dear Sophie, be assured you have not one thought which I am not well acquainted with, as well, child, as the French are with our motions, long before we put them in execution. Did you think, child, because you have been able to impose upon your father, that you could impose upon me? The world seemed to tilt beneath Sophia's feet. Her aunt continued relentless. I tell you, it is a passion you need not be ashamed of. It is a passion I myself approve, and have already brought your father into the approbation of it. Come, I have news which will delight your very soul. Make me your confidant, and I will undertake you shall be happy to the very extent of your wishes. La, madame, says Sophia, looking more foolishly than ever she did in her life, her mind reeling. I know not what to say. Why, madam, should you suspect? Nay, no dishonesty, returned Mrs. Western, a note of steel entering her voice. Consider you are speaking to one of your own sex, to an aunt, and I hope you are convinced you speak to a friend. Lastly, consider it is a passion which I highly approve. La, madame, says Sophia, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. You come upon one so unawares. To be sure, madame, I am not blind, and certainly if it be a fault to see all human perfections assembled together. But is it possible my father and you, madam, can see with my eyes? She was walking on a tightrope, pouring out her heart, while desperately hoping her aunt was picturing the same man. I tell you, answered the aunt, her smile triumphant, we do entirely approve, and this very afternoon your father hath appointed for you to receive your lover. My father this afternoon, cries Sophia, the blood draining from her face so quickly she felt light-headed. Yes, child, said the aunt, this afternoon. Well, I no sooner acquainted my brother, but he immediately wanted to propose it to Allworthy. He proposed it yesterday. Allworthy consented, and this afternoon, I tell you, you are to put on all your best airs. This afternoon, cries Sophia. Dear aunt, you frighten me out of my senses. Oh, my dear, said the aunt, you will soon come to yourself again, for he is a charming young fellow. That's the truth, aunt. Nay, I will own, says Sophia, a wave of delirious relief washing over her, believing the nightmare was over and the dream confirmed. I know none with such perfections, so brave and yet so gentle, so witty yet so inoffensive, so humane, so civil, so genteel, so handsome. What signifies his being base-born when compared with such qualifications as these? Base-born? What do you mean? Said the aunt, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet. Mr. Blifil base-born. Sophia turned instantly pale, the blood that had rushed back now freezing in her veins. Mr. Blifil, she faintly repeated the name a death knell. This scene is a master class in dramatic irony. Were you on the edge of your seat? Let us know your reaction in the comments. Upon which the aunt cried, "Mr. Blifil, I, Mr. Blifil, of whom else have we been talking? Good heavens, aunt, to sink to the floor of Mr. Jones, I thought. I am sure I know no other who deserves. I protest," cries the aunt. "You frighten me in your turn. Is it Mr. Jones, and not Mr. Blifil, who is the object of your affection?" "Mr. Blifil," repeated Sophia, the horror now complete. "Sure, it is impossible you can be in earnest. If you are, I am the most miserable woman alive." Mrs. Western now stood, a few moments silent, a statue of outraged nobility. The sparks of fiery rage that flashed from her eyes seemed to suck all the air from the room. At length, collecting all her force, she thundered forth, "And is it possible you can think of disgracing your family by allying yourself to a bastard? Can the blood of the Westerns submit to such contamination if you have not sense sufficient to restrain such monstrous inclinations? I thought the pride of our family would have prevented you from giving the least encouragement to so base an affection. Much less did I imagine you would ever have had the assurance to own it to my face," Madam answered Sophia, trembling like a leaf in a storm. "What I have said you have extorted from me. I do not remember to have ever mentioned the name of Mr. Jones with approbation to anyone before, nor should I now, had I not conceived he had your approbation. Whatever were my thoughts of that poor unhappy young man, I intended to have carried them with me to my grave, to that grave where only now I find I am to seek repose." Here she sunk down in her chair, drowned in a flood of tears, and in all the moving silence of unutterable grief, presented a spectacle which must have affected almost the hardest heart. But all this tender sorrow raised no compassion in her aunt. On the contrary, it poured oil on the flames. "And I would rather," she cried in a most vehement voice, "follow you to your grave than I would see you disgrace yourself and your family by such a match. O heavens, could I have ever suspected that I should live to hear a niece of mine declare a passion for such a fellow?" She ran on for a full quarter of an hour, a torrent of invective about family pride and the imprudence of women, until, having exhausted her breath rather than her rage, she concluded with threatening to go immediately and acquaint her brother. Terror cut through Sophia's despair. She threw herself at her aunt's feet, clinging to her hands, her tears now those of pure panic. She begged her to conceal what she had drawn from her, urging the violence of her father's temper, and protesting that no inclinations of hers should ever prevail with her to do anything which might offend him. Mrs. Western stood a moment, looking down at her, a judge considering a supplicant. Having recollected herself and realized the power she now wielded, she pronounced her sentence. She would keep the secret on one condition, only that Sophia promised to entertain Mr. Blifil that very afternoon as her lover and to regard him as her future husband. The pressure on Sophia is becoming unbearable. Subscribe now to witness her next move in this high-stakes game of hearts and duty. Poor Sophia was trapped, too much in her aunt's power to deny her anything positively. She was obliged to promise that she would see Mr. Blifil and be as civil to him as possible. but she begged for time for delay, hoping her father could be prevailed upon not to make her the most wretched of women. Mrs. Western assured her with a finality that brooked no argument that the match was entirely agreed upon. "I must own," said she, "I looked on it as on a matter of indifference, nay, perhaps had some scruples about it before, but now I regard it as the most eligible thing in the world." Her reasoning was as strategic as it was cruel. It would be bad politics indeed to protract a siege when the enemy's army is at hand and in danger of relieving it. "No, no," Sophie said. "She, as I am convinced, you have a violent passion which you can never satisfy with honor. I will do all I can to put your honor out of the care of your family. For when you are married, those matters will belong only to the consideration of your husband." Sophia well understood the vile implication that marriage would place her virtue under the guard of a husband, rendering her passion for Jones both futile and dangerous. She took a resolution, a bitter pill to swallow. She would see Mr. Blifil and behave with as much civility as she could muster. It was the only price for her aunt's silence. Her ill fortune, rather than any scheme of Mrs. Western, had unhappily drawn the confession from her, and this was the consequence. Mrs. Western, having extracted that bitter promise from her niece, withdrew from the room like a general leaving a conquered fortress. The air, thick with the residue of high emotion, seemed to vibrate in her wake. Presently after, the void was filled by the arrival of Mrs. Honor, who entered not as a mere servant, but as a fellow conspirator and a vessel of rampant curiosity. She had in fact been at work in a neighboring apartment. The raised voices had been an irresistible summons, drawing her to the keyhole as a magnet draws iron. There she had remained an unseen auditor for the remainder of the devastating dialogue. Her entry into the room was a performance in itself. She found Sophia standing motionless, a beautiful statue of despair, with silent tears tracing paths through the pallor of her cheeks. Upon this sight, Mrs. Honor, with the practiced ease of a professional sympathizer, immediately ordered a proper quantity of tears into her own eyes. Her face crumpled into a mask of shared distress. "Oh, Gemini, my dear lady," she began, her voice a hushed, dramatic whisper. "What is the matter?" "Nothing," cries Sophia, turning away to hide her face. The word, a hollow echo in the quiet room. "Nothing, oh dear madam," answers Honor, her tone implying she was too clever for such a transparent falsehood. "You must not tell me that when your ladyship is in this taking, and when there hath been such a preamble between your ladyship and Madam Western, the walls themselves are ringing with it." "Don't tease me," cries Sophia, a fresh wave of misery breaking over her. "I tell you, nothing is the matter. Good heavens, why was I born?" The existential cry was torn from the depths of her soul. "Nay, madam," says Mrs. Honor, pressing her advantage, "you shall never persuade me that your lordship can lament yourself so for nothing. To be sure, I am but a servant, but to be sure, I have been always faithful to your lordship, and to be sure, I would serve your lordship with my life." It was a trump card played with perfect timing. "My dear Honor," says Sophia, her resistance crumbling, "'tis not in thy power to be of any service to me. I am irretrievably undone." "Heaven forbid," answered the waiting woman, crossing herself with theatrical haste. But if I can't be of any service to you, pray tell me, madam. It will be some comfort to me to know. Pray, dear ma'am, tell me, what's the matter?" The plea was a master class in emotional manipulation. "My father," cries Sophia, "the dam finally breaking, is going to marry me to a man I both despise and hate." "Oh dear ma'am," answered the other, feigning a shock. She did not feel, "Who is this wicked man? For to be sure he is very bad, or your lordship would not despise him." She leaned in, hungry for the confirmation of what she already knew. "His name is poison to my tongue," replied Sophia, shuddering. "Thou wilt know it too soon." And indeed Honor knew it already, having heard every damning word through the oak of the door. She was not therefore very inquisitive on that point. Instead, she shifted to her true purpose encouragement. "I don't pretend to give your lordship advice," she began with false humility, "whereof your lordship knows much better than I can pretend to, being but a servant. But I fackins no father in England should marry me against my consent, and to be sure, the squire is so good that if he did but know your lordship despises and hates the young man, to be sure he would not desire you to marry him." She was weaving a web of hope, and Sophia was a desperate fly. "And if your lordship would but give me leave to tell my master so, to be sure it would be more properer to come from your own mouth. But as your lordship doth not care to foul your tongue with his nasty name, you are mistaken, Honor," says Sophia, dashing the nascent hope. "My father was determined before he ever thought fit to mention it to me." "More shame for him," cries Honor, with genuine indignation now. "You are to go to bed to him and not master, and off. A man may be a very proper man, yet every woman mayn't think him handsome alike, and what signifies your lordship having so great a fortune, if you can't please yourself with the man you think most handsomest? Honor is such a fascinating character. Is she a loyal friend or a mischievous gossip? What's your take? Comment below." Then, without a change in breath, she began to orbit the true subject of her mistress's heart. "Well, I say nothing, but to be sure it is a pity some folks had not been better born. Nay, as for that matter, I should not mind it myself. But then there is not so much money, and what of that? Your lordship hath money enough for both, and where can your lordship bestow your fortune better? For, to be sure, every one must allow that he is the most handsomest, charmingest, finest, tallest, properest man in the world." Sophia, though her heart leaped at the description, could not let such impertinence pass. "What do you mean by running on in this manner to me?" she cried, drawing herself up with a very grave countenance. "Have I ever given any encouragement for these liberties?" "Nay, ma'am, I ask pardon. I meant no harm," answered she, backtracking with skill. "But to be sure, the poor gentleman hath run in my head ever since I saw him this morning. To be sure, if your lordship had but seen him just now, you must have pitied him. Poor gentleman, I wishes some misfortune hath not happened to him, for he hath been walking about with his arms across, and looking so melancholy all this morning. I vow and protest, it made me almost cry to see him. The hook was baited and cast." "To see whom?" says Sophia, her feigned indifference transparent. "Poor Mr. Jones," answered Honor, as if the name were a casual afterthought. "See him? Why, Where did you see him? Cries Sophia, her composure vanishing. By the canal, ma'am, says Honor, her voice dripping with manufactured innocence. There he hath been walking all this morning, and at last there he laid himself down. I believe he lies there still. To be sure, if it had not been for my modesty, being a maid as I am, I should have gone and spoke to him. Do, ma'am, let me go and see only for a fancy whether he is there still. Pew, says Sophia, a desperate attempt to seem uninterested. There, no. What should he do there? He is gone before this time, to be sure. Besides, why? What? Why should you go to see? Besides, I want you for something else. Go fetch me my hat and gloves. I shall walk with my aunt in the grove before dinner. Honor did as she was, bid her face a mask of obedience. Sophia put her hat on her hands, trembling. Then, looking in the glass, a sudden agonizing thought struck her. She fancied the ribbon with which her hat was tied did not become her. It was a lie, she told herself, a delay born of a heart torn between propriety and passion. No, this ribbon will not do, she said, her voice strained. Go back, fetch me the blue one, and hurry. Then, giving Mrs. Honor repeated charges not to leave her work on any account, as she said. It was in violent haste, and must be finished that very day. She muttered something more about going to the grove. The moment Honor was out of sight, Sophia sallied out the opposite way and walked as fast as her tender, trembling limbs could carry her directly towards the canal. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Now for the cruel twist of fate. Jones had been there, as Mrs. Honor had reported. He had indeed spent 2 hours in melancholy contemplation of his Sophia, his own heart, a mirror of her despair. But so precise was their misfortune that he had gone out from the garden at one door the very moment she entered it at another. Those unlucky minutes spent in the frantic, vain changing of a ribbon had built an invisible wall between the lovers. It was a most unfortunate accident, a tiny, mundane delay that altered the course of their destiny. And so the lovers miss each other again. The suspense is unbearable. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the moment their paths finally cross. And here I must strictly forbid all male critics to intermeddle with this circumstance. I have recounted it only for the sake of the ladies who alone can truly understand the exquisite torture of a misplaced ribbon and the desperate hopeful flight of a heart in love. Upon this they only are at liberty to comment. It is a truth universally acknowledged and wisely remarked by one, and perhaps by more, that misfortunes are seldom solitary creatures. They hunt in packs. This grim maxim was now cruelly verified in the person of poor Sophia, who was not only bitterly disappointed in her hope of seeing the man she loved, but was now subjected to the exquisite vexation of dressing herself out of adorning her person as for a celebration, in order to receive a formal visit from the very man she hated and despised. That very afternoon, Mr. Western, with a bluntness that was his customary diplomacy, acquainted his daughter with his intention. "Come, Sophie," he said, his face beaming with what he mistook for benevolence. "No use in pretense. I know very well you have heard it all from your aunt." Sophia looked very grave upon this. a cold stone of dread settling in her stomach. She could not prevent a few betraying pearls from stealing into her eyes, gleaming with unshed sorrow. "Come, come," says Western, mistaking her grief for maidenly nerves. "None of your maidenish airs. I know all. I assure you, sister, hath told me all." "Is it possible?" says Sophia, her voice, a trembling whisper, "that my aunt can have betrayed me already?" The word betrayed was out before she could stop it. "Aye, aye," says Western, chuckling. "Betrayed you, aye. Why, you betrayed yourself yesterday at dinner. You showed your fancy very plainly for the young man, I think. But you young girls never know what you would be at. So you cry because I am going to marry you to the man you are in love with. Your mother, I remember, whimpered and whined just in the same manner, but it was all over within 24 hours after we were married." He spoke of love and marriage as if they were a minor ailment soon cured. "Mr. Blifil is a brisk young man and will soon put an end to your squeamishness. Come, cheer up, cheer up. I expect every minute." In that moment, Sophia was cruelly convinced that her aunt had behaved honorably. The misunderstanding was complete, a prison of her own making. She determined to go through that disagreeable afternoon with as much resolution as possible, a soldier facing a battle she knew she would lose, but without giving the least further suspicion to her father. Mr. Blifil soon arrived, polished and insipid as still water. Mr. Western, after a series of broad winks and encouraging nods, withdrew, leaving the young couple together in a silence that was thick and suffocating. Here a long silence ensued, stretching for near a quarter of an hour. It was not a comfortable silence, but an active, agonizing void. The gentleman who was to begin the conversation was afflicted with the unbecoming modesty, which consists not in humility, but in a kind of bashful self-absorption. He often attempted to speak, his lips parting only for the words to die at the very point of utterance, strangled by his own sense of propriety and conceit. At last they broke forth in a torrent, a flood of far-fetched and high-strained compliments stitched together from the commonplace books of courtly love. They were answered on her side by downcast looks, half-bows and civil monosyllables that fell like drops of ice. Blifil, from his profound inexperience in the ways of women and the bottomless well of his self-conceit, took this behavior for a modest assent. He saw not the revulsion, only a becoming shyness, and when Sophia, to shorten a scene which she could no longer support, rose up like a ghost and left the room without a word, he imputed that too merely to bashfulness. He comforted himself with the thought that he should soon have enough of her company, and that her fortune and her person were the sole objects of his wishes. The very idea of winning her heart never entered his head. He sought only absolute property. This meeting is so painfully awkward. What would you have done in Sophia's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. He was perfectly satisfied, for he knew the strict obedience Sophia paid to her father's will, and the greater still which her father would exact. Of Jones, he had not the least jealousy. He thought Jones's wild reputation made him odious to a modest lady, and he believed the affair of Molly Seagrim was still ongoing, a secret he possessed because Jones had once trusted him completely. This ignorance was his bliss, and and he saw no bar to his success. Mr. Western laid the lover at his exit. He found Blifil so elevated, so enamored with his own success, that the old gentleman began to caper and dance about his hall, a grotesque puppet of joy. He expressed his extravagance through a series of antic actions, for he had not the least command over any of his passions. Joy with him was as violent and unrefined as his rage. As soon as Blifil was departed laden with hearty kisses and embraces, the squire went instantly in quest of his daughter. He found her and poured forth the most extravagant raptures. "There, my little darling," he roared. "Choose what clothes and jewels you please. I have no other use for fortune but to make my Sophie happy." He caressed her again and again, with a profusion of fondness that felt overwhelming, calling her by the most endearing names, protesting she was his only joy on earth. Sophia, perceiving her father in this fit of affection, saw a glimmer of hope. She thought she would never have a better opportunity to disclose herself. After having thanked him for his kindness, she added, with a look full of inexpressible softness, "And is it possible my papa can be so good to place all his joy in his Sophie's happiness?" Western confirmed it with a great oath and a slobbering kiss. Seizing the moment, she then laid hold of his hand and, falling on her knees, her voice breaking with passionate declarations of affection and duty, she begged him not to make her the most miserable creature on earth by forcing her to marry a man whom she detested. "This I entreat of you, dear sir," said she, "for your sake as well as my own, since you are so very kind to tell me your happiness depends on mine." The transformation was instantaneous. "How? What?" says Western, his face darkening, his eyes staring wildly as if he could not comprehend the words. "Oh, sir," continued she, her tears flowing freely now, "not only your poor Sophie's happiness, her very life, her being depends upon your granting her request. I cannot live with Mr. Blifil. To force me into this marriage would be killing me." "You can't live with Mr. Blifil," says Western, the words a low growl. "No, upon my soul I can't," answered Sophia, her voice firm with desperate truth. "Then die, and B.D.D., cries he, spurning her from him with such violence that she stumbled back. "Oh, sir," cries Sophia, catching hold of the skirt of his coat like a drowning woman, "take pity on me, I beseech you. Don't look and say such cruel. Can you be unmoved while you see your Sophie in this dreadful condition? Can the best of fathers break my heart? Will he kill me by the most painful, cruel, lingering death?" "Pooh, pooh," cries the squire, his face a thundercloud. "All stuff and nonsense, all maidenish tricks. Kill you indeed. Will marriage kill you?" "Oh, sir," answered Sophia, her spirit flaring, "such a marriage is worse than death. He is not even indifferent. I hate and detest him." "If you detest never so much," cries Western, his voice rising to a roar, "you shall harm." This he bound by an oath too shocking to repeat. After many violent asseverations, he concluded with these words, "I am resolved upon the match, and unless you consent to it, I will not give you a groat, not a single farthing. No, though I saw you expiring with famine in the street, I would not relieve you with a morsel of bread. This is my fixed resolution, and so I leave you to consider on it." He then broke from her with such brutal violence that her face was dashed against the floor. He burst directly out of the room, leaving poor Sophia prostrate on the ground, her body aching, her heart shattered, the world a blur of pain and injustice. When Western stormed into the hall, he found Jones, who had been waiting there. Jones, seeing his friend looking wild, pale, and almost breathless with passion, could not forbear inquiring the reason, upon which the squire immediately acquainted him with the whole matter. His words, a torrent of bitter denunciations against Sophia, and pathetic lamentations on the misery of fathers cursed with disobedient daughters. Jones, to whom all the resolutions in favor of Blifil were still a secret, was almost struck dead by this relation. It was as if the floor had opened beneath him, but recovering his spirits, a mere despair, as he afterwards said, inspired him. It was a madness born of love and futility. He mentioned a matter to Mr. Western which seemed to require more impudence than a human forehead was ever gifted with. He desired leave to go to Sophia, that he might endeavor to obtain her concurrence with her father's inclinations. If the squire had been as quick-sighted as he was, remarkable for the contrary passion might have blinded him still, but in his simple, furious mind, an ally was an ally. He thanked Jones for offering to undertake the office and said, Go, prithee, try what canst do," and then swore many execrable oaths that he would turn her out of doors unless she consented to the match. The irony was tragic and complete. The drama is reaching its boiling point. How can this possibly end? Subscribe now to follow every heartbreaking twist in this timeless story. Jones departed instantly, his own heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He found Sophia just risen from the ground where her father's violence had left her a vision of devastating beauty and despair. The tracks of her tears gleamed on her pale cheeks in the fading afternoon light, and a thin, cruel trickle of blood ran from her softly bruised lip. The sight was a physical blow to him. He presently ran to her, his voice a chaotic mix of tenderness and sheer terror. "Oh, my Sophia," he cried, his hand hovering, afraid to touch, yet desperate to comfort. "What means this dreadful sight? Who has dared?" She looked softly at him for a moment, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of shock and fear. "Mr. Jones," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for heaven's sake, how came you here? Leave me, I beseech you, this moment." The words were a plea torn from a heart that feared for him more than for herself. "Do not," says he, his own composure shattering, "impose so harsh a command upon me. My heart bleeds faster than those lips. Oh, Sophia, how easily could I drain my veins to preserve one drop of that dear blood." It was no mere compliment. It was a savage, heartfelt truth. "I have too many obligations to you already," answered she, her voice barely audible. "For sure, you meant them such. Here." She looked at him tenderly. Almost a minute, a silent conversation passing between their souls. Then the dam broke, and she burst into a fresh agony. "Oh, Mr. Jones," she cried, "why did you save my life? My death would have been happier for us both." It was the cry of a spirit pushed to its absolute limit. Happier for us both, cried he, recoiling as if struck. Could racks or wheels kill me so painfully as Sophia's? I cannot bear the dreadful sound. Do I live but for her? Both his voice and looks were full of an inexpressible tenderness that filled the space between them. As he spoke, he laid gentle hold of her hand, a gesture of both supplication and possession. She did not withdraw. To say the truth, in the tempest of her emotions, she hardly knew what she did or suffered. His touch was both an anchor and a brand. A few moments passed in a silence more eloquent than any speech. His eyes were eagerly, hungrily fixed upon her face, while hers, heavy with shame and passion, declined towards the ground. At last, she recovered strength enough to voice her fear. "You must leave me," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "My certain ruin will be the consequence of our being found together. Oh, Mr. Jones, you know not what hath passed this cruel afternoon." "I know all, my Sophia," answered he, the words bitter on his tongue. "Your cruel father hath told me all, and he himself hath sent me hither to you." "My father sent you to me," replied she, pulling her hand back in shock. "Sure you dream." "Would to heaven," cries he, a bitter laugh escaping him. "It was but a dream. Oh, Sophia, your father hath sent me to you to be an advocate for my odious rival, to solicit you in his favor. I took any means, I seized any pretext to get access to you." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to an urgent, passionate whisper. "Oh, speak to me, Sophia, comfort my bleeding heart. Sure no one ever loved, ever doted like me. Do not unkindly withhold this dear, this soft, this gentle hand." He took it again, and this time his grasp was firmer. "One moment, perhaps, tears you forever from me. Nothing less than this cruel occasion could, I believe, have ever conquered the respect and awe with which you have inspired me. This confession is so raw and powerful. What do you think Sophia should do? Share your advice for her in the comments." She stood a moment, silent, covered with a confusion that was part shame, part burgeoning hope. Then, lifting her eyes gently towards him, a gesture of immense courage, she cried, "What would Mr. Jones have me say? Oh, do but promise," cries he, his whole soul in his eyes, "that you never will give yourself to Blifil." "Name not," answered she, a flash of her true spirit returning the detested sound. "Be assured, I never will give him what is in my power to withhold from him. It was a vow." "Now then," cries he, hope flaring like a sudden flame in the darkness, "while you are so perfectly kind, go a little farther and add that I may hope." "Alas," says she, the flame doused by cold reality, "Mr. Jones, whither will you drive me? What hope have I to bestow? You know my father's intentions." "But I know," answered he, with fierce intensity, "your compliance with them cannot be compelled." "What says she?" her voice breaking. "Must be the dreadful consequence of my disobedience. My own ruin is my least concern. I cannot bear the thoughts of being the cause of my father's misery." Her love for her father, however misguided he was a genuine and powerful chain. "He is himself the cause," cries Jones, his passion making him bold, "by exacting a power over you which nature hath not given him. Think on the misery which I am to suffer if I am to lose you, and see on which side pity will turn the balance." It was a desperate, selfish plea, and he knew it. "Think of it," replied she, her eyes now full of a poignant sorrow for him. "Can you imagine I do not feel the ruin which I must bring on you should I comply with your desire? It is that thought which gives me resolution to bid you fly from me forever and avoid your own destruction." Her greatest act of love in that moment was to send him away. "I fear no destruction," cries he, his voice low and fervent, "but the loss of Sophia. If you would save me from the most bitter agonies, recall that cruel sentence. Indeed, I can never part with you. Indeed, I cannot." The lovers now stood both silent and trembling, suspended in their private universe of anguish. Sophia was unable to withdraw her hand from Jones, and he was almost as unable to hold it, so profound was the emotion that rendered them both weak. They were a portrait of desperate, impossible love. The tension in this scene is absolutely heartbreaking. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss the consequence of this forbidden meeting. And then the scene, which I believe some of my readers will think had lasted long enough, was interrupted by one of so different a nature that we shall reserve the relation of it for a different chapter. Before we proceed with the fate of our lovers suspended in their tender and tragic tableau, it is absolutely necessary to step back into the hall and recount the storm that was brewing there, a storm that would soon break upon them with catastrophic force. Soon after Jones had left Mr. Western in the manner previously described, the squire was joined by his sister. With the air of a seasoned tactician, she was presently informed of all that had passed between her brother and Sophia. The girl's steadfast refusal, her declaration of hatred for Blifildis in the good lady's calculus, was an absolute breach of the condition on which she had promised to keep the secret of Sophia's love for Jones. Sophia had not been compliant. Therefore, Mrs. Western considered herself at full liberty to reveal all she knew. She did so without ceremony or preface, in the most explicit and damning terms. The idea of a marriage between Jones and his daughter had never for a single moment entered the squire's head. It was a concept as alien to him as marrying her to one of his hounds. He did indeed consider a parity of fortune to be as physically necessary an ingredient in marriage as difference of sexes. He had no more apprehension of his daughter falling in love with a poor man than with an animal of a different species. It was a biological and social impossibility. Therefore, the effect of his sister's relation was that of a physical blow. He became like a man thunderstruck. He was at first incapable of making any answer the violence of the surprise, almost depriving him of breath. But, as is usual in such cases, the breath returned after its intermission with redoubled force and fury, like a tempest gathering strength in a lull. The first use he made of this recovered power of speech was to discharge a round volley of oaths and imprecations that would have made a sailor blush, after which he did not walk, but rather erupted from the room, proceeding hastily to the apartment where he expected to find the lovers. He murmured, or rather roared forth his intentions of revenge with every step a one-man avalanche of wrath. Now, imagine a scene of perfect pastoral love. Two doves, or perhaps the literary lovers, Strephon and Phyllis, are retired into some pleasant, solitary grove. The world is serene, the air is soft, and they are engrossed in the delightful, bashful conversation of love. A boy who never speaks in public and is never a good companion to more than two at a time. Here, while every object promises eternal peace, should hoarse thunder burst suddenly through the shattered clouds, rumbling and rolling across the sky, the frightened maid would start from her mossy bank. The pale livery of death would instantly succeed the red regimentals in which love had just dressed her cheeks. Fear would shake her whole frame, and her lover would scarce be able to support her trembling, tottering limbs. Or, for a more modern simile, imagine two gentlemen strangers to the local customs are quietly cracking a bottle together at an inn in Salisbury. If the great dowdy, the town fool who plays his part a little too well, should suddenly rattle his chains and dreadfully hum forth some grumbling catch along the gallery, the frightened strangers would stand aghast. They would seek any place of shelter from the approaching danger, and if the windows were not barred, would likely venture their necks to escape. In such a manner trembled poor Sophia. So turned she pale at the noise of her father, who in a voice most dreadful to hear came on swearing, cursing, and vowing the destruction of Jones. To say the truth, I believe the youth himself, from some prudent considerations, would have preferred another place of abode at that precise moment, but his terror for Sophia's safety completely overshadowed any concern for his own. The tension is becoming unbearable. What do you think will happen when the squire finds them? Share your predictions in the comments. And now the squire, having burst open the door with a sound like splintering fate, beheld an object which instantly suspended his fury against Jones. This was the ghastly appearance of Sophia, who had fainted dead away in her lover's arms. Her pallor, her lifeless form, it was a tragical sight that struck a deeper chord than anger. Mr. Western no sooner beheld it than all his rage forsook him, replaced by a primal, panicked fear. He roared for help with his utmost violence, ran first to his daughter, then back to the door screaming for water, and then back again to Sophia. In his terror, he never considered in whose arms she lay, nor perhaps once recollected that Jones existed. His daughter's present circumstance was the sole object that could ever truly occupy his entire being. Mrs. Western and a great number of servants soon flooded the room with water cordials and every remedy for a fainting fit. These were applied with such success that Sophia, in a very few minutes, began to recover color, slowly returning to her cheeks, upon which she was presently led off by her own maid and Mrs. Western. That good lady did not depart without leaving some wholesome admonitions with her brother on the dreadful effects of his passion, or as she pleased to call it, his madness, delivered in a symphony of obscure hints, significant shrugs, and sharp notes of admiration. The squire perhaps did not understand this advice, or, if he did, he profited little from it, for no sooner was the immediate fear for his daughter cured than he relapsed into his former frenzy. He would have launched himself at Jones immediately had not Parson Supple, a man of surprisingly strong and clerical physique, been present. Using mere force, he restrained the squire from acts of hostility, wrapping his arms around the struggling gentleman like a bear. The moment Sophia was departed, Jones advanced in a very suppliant manner to Mr. Western, who was still held fast in the parson's embrace. Sir Jones begged, his voice calm but urgent. "I beseech you, be pacified. While you continue in such a passion, it is impossible to give you any satisfaction." "I will have satisfaction of thee," answered the squire, spitting with rage. "So doff thy clothes, add un't half a man, and I'll lick thee as well as wast ever licked in thy life." He then bespattered the youth with an abundance of that rustic language which passes between country gentlemen on opposing sides, with frequent and colourful invitations for Jones to salute that part of the anatomy which features prominently in Zucht disputes. To all this, Jones very calmly answered, "Sir, this usage may perhaps cancel every other obligation you have conferred on me, but there is one you can never cancel, nor will I be provoked by your abuse to lift my hand against the father of Sophia." At these words the squire grew, if possible, more outrageous. The parson, sweating with effort, begged Jones to retire. "You behold, sir, how he waxeth wrath at your abode here. Therefore I pray you do not tarry. You had better conclude your visit and refer your matters to some other opportunity." Jones accepted this advice with thanks and immediately departed. The squire, now regaining the liberty of his hands, seemed almost satisfied with the restraint, declaring he would certainly have beat his own brains out in the fight. "It would have vexed one confoundedly," he added, "to have been hanged for such a rascal." The parson now began to triumph in his peacemaking, launching into a lecture against anger richly decorated with quotations from Seneca. He concluded with the famous story of Alexander and Clytus, though as I find that story in my commonplace book under the title Drunkenness, I shall not insert it here. The squire took no notice, interrupting him by calling for a tankard of beer, observing with some rustic wisdom that anger makes a man dry. The stakes have never been higher for Jones. Subscribe now to discover the consequences when Squire Western carries out his threat to see Mr. Allworthy. No sooner had he swallowed a large draught than he renewed his discourse on Jones, declaring his resolution to go early the next morning and acquaint Mr. Allworthy with everything. His friend Supple attempted to dissuade him out of mere good nature, but this only produced another volley of oaths, which greatly shocked the parson's pious ears. Yet he did not dare remonstrate, for the squire claimed this as the privilege of a freeborn Englishman. To be truthful, the parson submitted, pleasing his palate, at the squire's table, at the expense of his ears. He contented himself with the thought that he did not promote the practice, and that the squire would not swear an oath the less for his absence. However, though he would not rebuke a gentleman in his own house, he paid him back obliquely from the pulpit. This did not reform the squire, but it so far operated on his conscience that he put the laws severely in execution against others. Thus the magistrate became the only person in the parish who could swear with impunity. Mr. Allworthy had just retired from breakfast with his nephew, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling in his breast. He was well pleased with the report of Blifil's successful visit to Sophia, for he greatly desired the match. This desire sprang not from the young lady's considerable riches, but from the exemplary sweetness of her character, which he believed would be a blessing to his nephew. It was in this peaceful, hopeful atmosphere that Mr. Western broke abruptly in upon them, a thunderclap of chaos, shattering the morning calm. He was hatless, his face flushed, a violent purple, his wig askew. Without any ceremony, he began as follows. "There, you have done a fine piece of work, truly. You have brought up your bastard to a fine purpose. Not that I believe you had any hand in it, neither that is, as a man may say designedly, but there is a fine kettle of fish made on up at our house." His words were bullets fired randomly in his rage. "What can be the matter?" Mr. Weston said Allworthy, his own composure, a stark contrast to the squire's frenzy. "Oh, matter, enow of all conscience," roared Weston. "My daughter hath fallen in love with your bastard. That's all, but I won't gie her a halfpenny, not the 20th part of a brass varden. I always thought what would come of breeding up a bastard like a gentleman, and letting un come about to volks' houses. It's well vor un I could not get at un. I'd a licked un, I'd a spoiled his caterwauling, I'd a taught the son of a whore to meddle with meat for his master. He shan't ever have a morsel of meat of mine or a varden to buy it. If she will, on one smock shall be her portion. I'd sooner gie my estate to the zinking fund that it may be sent to Hanover to corrupt our nation with his tirade was a spectacular mix of personal insult and incoherent political grievance. I am heartily sorry, cries Allworthy, the shock evident on his noble features. Poxy your sorrow, says Weston, spitting the words. It will do me abundance of good when I have lost my only child. My poor Sophie, that was the joy of my heart, and all the hope and comfort of my age. But I am resolved, I will turn her out of doors. She shall beg and starve and rot in the streets. Not one halfpenny, not a halfpenny shall she ever hae o' mine. He then fixed his wild eyes on Blifil. The son of a bitch was always good at finding a hare sitting and be rotted to, and I little thought what puss he was looking after. But it shall be the worst he ever vound in his life. She shall be no better than carrion the skin or is all he shall ha. And zoo you may tell, I am in amazement, cries Allworthy, struggling to reconcile this with what he knew. At what you tell me, after what passed between my nephew and the young lady, no longer ago than yesterday. Yes, sir, answered Weston. It was after what passed between your nephew and she that the whole matter came out. Mr. Blifil there was no sooner gone than the son of a whore came lurching about the house. Little did I think when I used to love him for a sportsman that he was all the while a poaching after my daughter. Why, truly, says Allworthy with a heavy sigh, I could wish you had not given him so many opportunities with her, and you will do me the justice to acknowledge that I have always been averse to his staying so much at your house, though I own I had no suspicion of this kind. Why, zounds, cries Weston, who could have thought it. What the devil had she to do when he did not come there a-courting to her? He came there a-hunting with me. I never so much as seed him kiss her in all my life. And as for the girl, she was always less civil to un than to any young man that came to the house. As to that matter, I am not more easy to be deceived than another. I would not have you think I am neighbour. Allworthy could scarce refrain from laughter at the squire's blind confidence, but he mastered himself. He then asked Weston what he would have him do, to which the other answered that he would have him keep the rascal away from his house, and that he would go and lock up the wench, for he was resolved to make her marry Mr. Blifil, in spite of her teeth. He then shook Blifil by the hand, swore he would have no other son-in-law, and took his leave, muttering about needing to hurry home before his daughter gave him the slip. The plot is twisting dramatically. Who do you think is more at fault in this situation? Share your perspective in the comments. When Allworthy and Blifil were again left together, a long, heavy silence ensued. Blifil filled this interval with a performance of deep sighs, which proceeded partly from disappointed ambition, but much more from pure, unadulterated hatred. For the success of Jones was a far more bitter draught than the loss of Sophia. At length his uncle asked him what he was determined to do. Blifil answered in words, dripping with feigned virtue and internal conflict. Alas, sir, can it be a question? What step a lover will take when reason and passion point different ways? I am afraid it is too certain he will, in that dilemma, always follow the latter. He then constructed a delicate web of justification, arguing that by pursuing Sophia, he would be promoting the happiness of all parties by saving her from a wastrel and a beggar. Then he struck his masterstroke, his voice dropping as if in painful confidence. Nay, that is a trifle, for I know him to be one of the worst men in the world. For had my dear uncle known what I have hitherto endeavoured to conceal, he must have long since abandoned so profligate a wretch. How, said Allworthy, leaning forward, hath he done anything worse than I already know? Tell me, I beseech you. No, replied Blifil, with a well-practiced hesitation. It is now past, and perhaps he may have repented of it. I command you on your duty, said Allworthy, his voice firm, to tell me what you mean. You know, sir, says Blifil, I never disobeyed you, but I am sorry I mentioned it, since it may now look like revenge, whereas, I thank heaven, no such motive ever entered my heart. He then, with theatrical reluctance, unveiled his poisoned gifts, the story of Jones's very night of Allworthy's mortal sickness, and the violent assault on the worthy Mr. Thwackum, who had tried to correct him. How cries Allworthy, a cold dread seizing him. Did he dare to strike you? I am sure, cries Blifil, with a martyr's air, I have forgiven him that long ago. I wish I could so easily forget his ingratitude to the best of benefactors. He painted a picture of such depravity that Allworthy's face grew ashen. O child, said Allworthy, his heart breaking, I know not whether I should blame or applaud your goodness in concealing such villainy a moment. He immediately sent for Thwackum, who appeared with the eagerness of a long-suppressed accuser. Thwackum corroborated every circumstance, his zeal making the account even blacker. Nay, he produced the record upon his own breast, where the handwriting of Mr. Jones remained legible in ugly splotches of black and blue. He concluded with a pious declaration that only Mr. Blifil's merciful intercessions had prevented him from revealing this sooner. In reality, Blifil had his own cunning reasons for the delay. He knew that men are softened by sickness, and he wanted to hoard these complaints until they could be unleashed together for maximum effect. He had been waiting for the perfect moment to crush Jones and Fortune, and his own malice had now kindly presented it. The noose is tightening around poor Jones. Subscribe now to witness the devastating consequences of Blifil's treachery. True to the integrity of his character, Mr. Allworthy held to his custom of never punishing anyone In the heat of passion, he would not be a tyrant, even in his profound disappointment. Therefore he resolved to let the storm within his own heart settle, delaying the passing of sentence on Jones until the afternoon. This interval was a special kind of torture for all parties. The poor young man attended at dinner as usual, a ghost. At the feast, the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation felt like a mockery. His heart was a leaden weight in his chest, making the very sight of food repulsive. His grief was sharpened into agony by the unkind, averted looks of Mr. Allworthy, a frost that had replaced the lifelong sunshine of his regard. Jones concluded naturally that Squire Western had stormed in and discovered the entire affair with Sophia. But as for Mr. Blifil's secret poison, he had not the least apprehension of the greater part of those hidden accusations. He was entirely innocent, and for the rest, the old forgiven transgressions of drink and high spirits, he had buried them so completely in his own heart that he never dreamed they had been exhumed and weaponized by another. When dinner was over and the servants had departed, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence, Mr. Allworthy began to speak. His voice was not loud, but it was terrible in its calm finality. He set forth in a long and sorrowful speech the many iniquities of which Jones had been guilty. He spoke of the wildness of his youth, the squandering of his opportunities, and then, his voice growing colder, he turned to the crimes which this day had brought to light. He painted a picture of a dissolute, ungrateful wretch carousing while his benefactor lay at death's door and violently assaulting the very men who sought to guide him. He concluded with words that fell like a headsman's axe. "Unless you can clear yourself of this charge, I am resolved to banish you from my sight forever." Many disadvantages attended poor Jones in making his defense. He was really accused of a crime he didn't fully comprehend. For as Mr. Allworthy, in recounting the story of the drunkenness, had out of a sense of modesty omitted everything that related particularly to himself, which was, in fact, the very core of the crime, Jones was left with a vague charge of general debauchery. His heart was already shattered, his spirit so utterly sunk that the power of speech seemed to have deserted him. He could not marshal his thoughts, could not summon the words to refute the grotesque portrait being presented. In his despair, he did what a heart too full for argument often does. He acknowledged the whole. "Sir," he said, his voice choked, "I must own myself guilty of many follies and inadvertencies. I have been wild, I have been thoughtless, but I hope, I pray, I have done nothing to deserve what would be to me the greatest punishment in the world, the loss of your favour and my only home." Allworthy's answer was like a door slamming shut. "I have forgiven you too often already. I forgave you in compassion to your youth and in the hope of your amendment. I now find I was nurturing an abandoned reprobate, a creature it would be criminal in anyone to support and encourage." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Nay, your audacious attempt to steal away the young lady calls upon me to justify my own character in punishing you. The world, which has already censured the regard I have shown you, may think with some colour of justice that I connive at so base and barbarous an action you knew I would abhor, an action which, had you any concern for my ease and honour as well as my friendship, you would never have dreamed of undertaking." He shook his head, a world of sorrow in the gesture. Fie upon it, young man. There is scarce any punishment equal to your crimes, and I scarce think myself justifiable in the leniency I now show. However, as I have educated you like a child of my own, I will not turn you naked into the world." He held out a sealed paper. His hand for the first time trembled slightly. "When you open this, you will find something which may enable you with industry to get an honest livelihood. But if you employ it to worse purposes, I shall not think myself obliged to supply you, Father. I am resolved from this day forward to converse no more with you on any account. This moment is absolutely devastating. What would you do if you were in Tom's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below." Then he delivered the final bitterest blow. "I cannot avoid saying there is no part of your conduct which I resent more than your ill treatment of that good young man," he meant, "Blifil, who hath behaved with so much tenderness and honor towards you." These last words were a dose of poison, almost too bitter to be swallowed. That his beloved Sophia's name was not the final word, but that of the hypocrite who had destroyed him, was a cruelty beyond bearing. A flood of tears which shame and sorrow had hitherto restrained now gushed from the eyes of Jones. Every faculty of speech and motion seemed to have deserted him. He stood as a statue of grief, silently weeping. It was some time before he could obey Allworthy's peremptory command to depart. When he could move, he did not speak. Instead, he crossed the room, took Allworthy's limp hand and kissed it with a passion that was difficult to affect and impossible to describe, a kiss of farewell, of gratitude, of utter despair. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of his old life. The reader must be very weak indeed if, when considering the light in which Jones then appeared to Mr. Allworthy, a lying, drunken, violent ingrate who sought to ruin a young lady, he should blame the rigor of the sentence. Allworthy acted on the information he had from sources he trusted implicitly, and yet all the neighborhood, either from this weakness or from some worse motive, condemned this justice as the highest cruelty. The very persons who had once censured the good man for his excessive kindness to a bastard were now the loudest in crying out against the inhumanity of turning his own child out of doors. The women especially were unanimous in taking Jones's part, and raised more stories on the occasion than I have room in this chapter to set down. One thing must not be omitted. In their censures, none ever mentioned the sum contained in the paper which Allworthy gave. Jones, which was no less than £500, a princely sum, a fortune for a common man. But all agreed that he was sent away penniless, and some with a flair for the dramatic said naked from the house of his inhuman father. So passes the truth, and so is born the legend. The world has turned against Tom Jones. His journey into a harsh and unknown England begins now. Don't miss a single moment of his epic story. Subscribe for the next chapter. Jones was commanded to leave the house immediately, the words ringing in his ears like a funeral bell. He was told that his clothes and everything else would be sent to him wherever he should order them, a cold, logistical postscript to the end of his life as he knew it. He was a parcel to be dispatched, a problem to be removed. He accordingly set out walking, without seeing, moving, without direction. He traversed more than a mile, not regarding, and indeed scarce knowing whither he went. The familiar lanes and fields of his youth were now a blur of green and brown, a painted backdrop to his personal tragedy. At length a little brook, one he had skipped across as a boy obstructed his passage. The gentle babble of the water seemed to mock the tempest in his soul. His legs could carry him no further. He threw himself down by the side of it, and nor could he help muttering with a spark of his old spirit, "Sure, my father will not deny me this place to rest in." The irony was as sharp as a knife. Here the dam of his composure broke entirely. He fell into the most violent agonies, a spectacle of pure, undiluted despair. He tore at his hair as if to root out the memory of Sophia. He beat his fists against the turf and used most other actions which generally accompany fits of madness, rage, and despair. It was the death throes of his old hope. When he had in this manner vented the first uncontrollable emotions of his passion, he began to come trembling back to himself. His grief now took a quieter, more insidious turn, discharging itself in a flood of silent tears that felt they would never cease. It was in this state of exhausted coolness that he finally began to reason with his passion, to consider what steps were proper to be taken in his deplorable condition. And now, the torturous doubt was how to act with regard to Sophia. The mere thought of leaving her, of never again beholding her face, felt like tearing his own heart from his chest. But the consideration of reducing her to ruin and beggary, of making her an outcast for his sake, racked him, if possible more. Even if the violent desire of possessing her could have tempted him for a moment, he was far from certain she would agree to her own destruction for his love. The image of Mr. Allworthy's devastated face argued strongly against it. Lastly, the sheer apparent impossibility of success, even if he sacrificed all these scruples, came to his assistance. And thus, honor backed by despair, gratitude to his benefactor, and real love for his mistress, finally got the better of burning desire. He resolved with a sorrow that felt like death to quit Sophia rather than pursue her to her ruin. This is such a noble yet heartbreaking decision. Do you think Tom is doing the right thing? Share your opinion in the comments. It is difficult for any who have not felt it to conceive the strange glowing warmth that filled his breast upon this first contemplation of his victory over his own heart. Pride, that subtle flatterer, whispered that he had acted like a hero, and his mind for a fleeting moment enjoyed a kind of perfect, self-sacrificing happiness. But it was only momentary. The image of Sophia soon returned to his imagination and allayed the joy of his triumph with pangs, as bitter as those a good-natured general must feel when he surveys the bleeding heaps of his own men, at the price of whose blood he hath purchased his laurels. For 1,000 tender hopes and future joys lay murdered before our conqueror. Being resolved, however, to pursue the paths of this giant honor, he determined to write a farewell letter to Sophia. He proceeded to a house not far off a humble farmstead, where, being furnished with proper materials, he poured his soul onto the page. Madam, when you reflect on the situation in which I write, I am sure your good nature will pardon any inconsistency or absurdity which my letter contains, for everything here flows from a heart so full that no language can express its dictates. I have resolved, madam, to obey your commands in flying forever from your dear, your lovely sight. Cruel indeed those commands are, but it is a cruelty which proceeds from fortune, not from my Sophia. Believe me, I would not hint all my sufferings to you if I imagined they could possibly escape your ears. I know the goodness and tenderness of your heart. Oh, let nothing which you shall hear of my hard fortune cause a moment's concern, for after the loss of you everything is to me a trifle. Oh, Sophia, it is hard to leave you. It is harder still to desire you to forget me. Yet the sincerest love obliges me to both. Think I never loved you, or think truly how little I deserve you, and learn to scorn me. I am unable to say more. May guardian angels protect you forever. He was now searching his pockets for his wax to seal this tragic missive, but found none. Nor indeed did he find anything else. In his frantic disposition by the brook, he had tossed everything from him, and amongst the rest, his pocketbook, the very one he had received from Mr. Allworthy, which he had never opened, and which now, with a sickening lurch, first occurred to his memory. His entire fortune, his only means of survival, was gone. The house supplied him with a wafer for his present purpose. With his letter sealed, he returned hastily towards the brook. A new pragmatic fear cutting through his poetic despair. On his way he met his old friend Black George, the gamekeeper, who with a face of long gravity heartily condoled with him on his misfortune, for the news had already spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Jones acquainted George with his loss. The gamekeeper, with a show of ready friendship, went back with him to the brook. They searched every tuft of grass, every possible hiding place, with a diligence that appeared commendable, but all was in vain, for though the items were indeed in the meadow, they omitted to search the only place where they were deposited, the pockets of the said George. He had found them just before, and being luckily apprised of the pocketbook's considerable value, had very carefully pocketed it for his own use. His gratitude, wilting before the sun of his avarice, having exerted this charade of diligence, George desired Mr. Jones to recollect if he had been in no other place. For sure, said he, with feigned logic, if you had lost them here so lately, the things must have been here still, for this is a very unlikely place for anyone to pass by. The irony was thick. It was only by great accident that George himself had passed through to lay wires for hares. Jones now gave over all hope. Turning to Black George, he asked him earnestly if he would do him the greatest favor in the world. George answered with a palpable hesitation, "Sir, you know, you may command me whatever is in my power." In fact, the question staggered him. He feared Jones wanted to borrow from the very sum he had just stolen. He was swiftly relieved when Jones only desired him to convey the letter to Sophia, a task he promised to do with great pleasure. And indeed he bore as much gratitude towards Jones as a man who loves money better than anything in the universe generally can. Mrs. Honor was agreed upon as the proper conduit. They separated. George returned to Mr. Weston's, and Jones walked to a distant alehouse to wait his heart, a tumult of sorrow and a faint lingering spark of hope. George, no sooner arriving home, met with Mrs. Honor. After a few sly, probing questions, he delivered the letter for her mistress, and received at the same time another from her for Mr. Jones. Honor confessed she had carried it all day in her bosom, despairing of finding a means to deliver it. The gamekeeper returned hastily and joyfully to Jones, who received Sophia's letter as a dying man might receive water. He instantly withdrew, broke the seal with trembling fingers and read, "Sir, it is impossible to express what I have felt since I saw you. Your submitting on my account to such cruel insults from my father lays me under an obligation I shall ever own. As you know his temper, I beg you will for my sake avoid him. I wish I had any comfort to send you, but believe this, that nothing but the last violence shall ever give my hand or heart where you would be sorry to see them bestowed." Jones read this letter 100 times over, kissing it 100 times as often. His passion, momentarily subdued by honor, now flooded back, bringing all tender desires with it. He repented his own noble farewell letter. He repented even more that in the interval of waiting he had written to Mr. Allworthy, faithfully promising to quit all thoughts of his love. Yet when his cool reflections returned, he saw that Sophia's note, while a balm to his heart, did not materially mend his case. It only offered a tiny, desperate glimpse of hope rooted in her constancy. Therefore he resumed his resolution. Taking a bitter leave of Black George, he set forward to a town 5 miles distant, where he had asked for his things to be sent. He was now not only heartbroken and banished, but also penniless, his future balanced on a thread of hope and the strength of a woman's promise. Tom's journey is just beginning, and he's already been betrayed and left with nothing. Subscribe to follow his epic and treacherous path through England. For Sophia, the last 24 hours had passed in a manner most undesirable, a slow, grinding torture of the spirit. A large part of them had been occupied by her aunt, who, like a relentless sermonizer, delivered lengthy lectures on prudence. Mrs. Western recommended the example of the polite world, where love, so the good lady asserted, was currently treated as a ridiculous fairy tale, and where women considered matrimony, as men do, a government post, purely as a means of making their fortune and climbing higher in society. On this cynical text, Mrs. Western had displayed her eloquence for what felt to Sophia like an eternity. These sagacious lectures, though utterly unsuited to Sophia's taste or inclination, were, however, less irksome than the company of her own thoughts. Those were the entertainment of the long, dark night, a relentless parade of fears and memories, during which she never once closed her eyes. Though she could neither sleep nor find rest, she remained in her bed, having no reason to leave it. It was there her father found her, upon his return from Allworthy's, his face still flushed with the aftermath of fury. He went directly to her apartment, opened the door, and seeing her still abed, cried out, "Oh, you are safe, then, and I am resolved to keep you so." It was the declaration of a jailer, not a father. He then locked the door from the outside and delivered the key to honor, having first given the maid the strictest charges with grand promises of reward for her fidelity, and the most dreadful menaces of punishment should she betray her. Trust, honor's orders were absolute not to suffer her mistress to come out of her room without the squire's direct authority, and to admit no one but him and her aunt. She was, however, to attend Sophia with whatever she pleased except pen, ink, and paper. Sophia's voice was to be silenced, her pleas unable to travel beyond the walls of her gilded cage. The squire ordered his daughter to dress herself and attend him at dinner. a command she obeyed with the numb automatism of a prisoner. Having sat through the meal for the usual agonizing time, she was again conducted back to her prison without a word of comfort. In the evening, the jailer, honor her heart, a conflicted mix of duty and sympathy, brought her the letter from the gamekeeper. Sophia took it, her hands trembling with a volatile cocktail of hope and dread. She read it very attentively, once, twice, a third time, each word landing like a blow. Then the strength left her body. She threw herself upon the bed and burst into a flood of tears, the final outlet for a heart that could contain no more sorrow. Mrs. Honor expressed great astonishment at this behavior. "La Mam," she cried. "What is the matter?" I thought. The letter would cheer you. When Sophia remained silent, sobbing into her pillows, Honor could not forbear eagerly begging to know the cause of this new passion. Sophia made her no answer for some time. Then, starting suddenly up, she caught her maid by the hand, her eyes wild with despair. "Oh, Honor, I am undone." "Marry forbid," cries Honor, recoiling. "I wish the letter had been burnt before I had brought it to your lordship. I'm sure I thought it would have comforted you, or I would have seen it at the devil before I would have touched it." "Honor," says Sophia, her voice dropping to a broken whisper, "you are a good girl, and it is vain to attempt concealing my weakness from you any longer. I have thrown away my heart on a man who hath forsaken me, and is." "Mr. Jones," answered the maid, her eyes wide. "Such a perfidy man! He hath taken his leave of me," says Sophia, "forever, in that letter. Nay, he hath desired me to forget him. Could he have desired that if he had loved me, could he have borne such a thought? Could he have written such a word?" Her voice broke on every question. "No, certainly, ma'am," cries Honor, with the absolute confidence of one who has never known such a passion. "And to be sure, if the best man in England was to desire me to forget him, I'd take him at his word. Marry, come up. A young lady who may take her choice of all the young men in the country. And to be sure there is young Mr. Blifil, who is a more handsomer and a more politer man by half. Name not his detested name," cries Sophia, a flash of her old fire returning. "Nay, ma'am," says Honor, unabashed, "if your lordship doth not like him, there be more jolly, handsome young men that would court you, if they had but the least encouragement. I don't believe there is arrow young gentleman in this county, or in the next to it, that, if your lordship was but to look as if you had a mind to him, would not come about to make his offers directly." "What a wretch dost thou imagine me," cries Sophia, utterly appalled by affronting my ears with such stuff. "I detest all mankind." Sophia's despair is so palpable. What do you think of her decision to send Tom all her money? Let us know in the comments. "Nay, to be sure, ma'am," answered Honor, misreading her mistress's pain. "Entirely your lordship hath had enough to give you a surfeit of them, to be used ill by such a poor beggarly bastardly fellow." "Hold your blasphemous tongue," cries Sophia, her loyalty flaring like a shield. "How dare you mention his name with disrespect before me? He used me ill. No, his poor bleeding heart suffered more when he read the cruel words than mine from reading them. Oh, he is all heroic virtue and angelic goodness." A fresh wave of tears came, but these were of admiration, not despair. I am ashamed of the weakness of my own passion for blaming what I ought to admire. O Honor, It is my good only which he consults. To my interest he sacrifices both himself and me. The apprehension of ruining me hath driven him to despair. I am very glad, says Honor, completely missing the point, to hear your lordship takes that into your consideration. For to be sure, it must be nothing less than ruin to give your mind to one that is turned out of doors and is not worth a farthing in the world. Turned out of doors, cries Sophia, seizing upon the phrase as if it were a live coal. How? What dost thou mean? Why, to be sure, ma'am, said Honor, now realizing she had let slip a terrible secret. My master no sooner told Squire Allworthy about Mr. Jones having offered to make love to your lordship than the squire stripped him stark naked and turned him out of doors. Ha, says Sophia, the colour draining from her face. A new, more terrible understanding dawned. I have been the cursed, wretched cause of his destruction, turned naked out of doors. Her maternal protective instinct surged forth. Here, Honor, take all the money I have. Take the rings from my fingers. Here, my watch, carry him all. Go find him immediately. For heaven's sake, ma'am, answered Mrs. Honor, a practical fear overriding sympathy. Do but consider, if my master should miss any of these things, I should be made to answer for them. Besides the money, I think is enough of all conscience. And as for that, my master can never know anything of the matter. Here then, cries Sophia, thrusting a purse into Honor's hands, take every farthing I am worth, find him out immediately and give it him. Go, go, lose not a moment. Mrs. Honor departed according to orders. Finding Black George below stairs, she delivered the purse, which contained 16 guineas, the entire worldly fortune of Sophia. For though her father was liberal, her own generous heart had always ensured she was too charitable to be rich. Black George, having received the purse, set forward towards the alehouse, but his journey was immediately interrupted by a war within his own breast. A thought dark and seductive occurred to him. Should he not detain this money likewise? His conscience, a faint but persistent voice, immediately started at this suggestion. Ungrateful wretch, it cried, would you rob the very woman your benefactor loves? This is a sacred trust. To this his avarice, a much louder and more persuasive orator, answered with a sneer. And where were you, O conscience, when we pocketed the £500? You were quiet enough. Then, having quietly acquiesced in what was of so much greater importance, it is absurd, if not downright hypocrisy, to affect any qualms at this trifle. In return, conscience, like a clever lawyer, attempted to distinguish that was a mere concealment of found property. This is an absolute breach of trust. The goods were delivered directly into your hand for a specific purpose. Avarice treated this with ridicule, a distinction without a difference. Once you have given up the pretensions of honor in one instance, you cannot resort to them upon a second. The dam is broken, my friend. In short, poor conscience was on the verge of a total defeat, gasping under the logic of corruption. But then an unexpected ally stepped in. Fear. Fools whispered fear. The distinction is not in honor, but in safety. The £500 was found. Who could prove otherwise? But this 16 guineas, the maid honor, knows you have it. If Jones does not receive it, she will tell her mistress, who will tell the squire, and you will be hanged, or at the very least transported. The risk is immense. By this friendly aid of fear conscience obtained a complete, if cynical, victory. After making a few weak compliments on George's honesty, it forced him to deliver the money to Jones. The battle was won not by virtue, but by terror. The twists of fate and character in this story are incredible. Subscribe now to see if Jones ever discovers the truth about his missing fortune. Fortune, it seemed, had decreed that Sophia should be subjected to every form of oppression that day. Having endured the spiritual tyranny of her aunt's lectures and the physical tyranny of her father's lock and key, she was now to witness the clash of these two despots over the spoils of her own freedom. Mrs. Western had been engaged abroad all that day, occupied with the weighty gossip and delicate intrigues that constituted her version of statecraft. The squire met her at her return home. His chest puffed out his face, a canvas of prodigious wisdom and sagacity. When she inquired after Sophia, he acquainted her that he had secured her safe enough. "She is locked up in her chamber," he cried, a triumphant gleam in his eye, "and honor keeps the key." He delivered this information as if announcing a great military victory, fully expecting a shower of applause from his sister for his decisive action. But how was he disappointed? Her face, upon hearing this news, did not light up with approval, but contorted into a mask of the most utter disdain. "Brother," she said, her voice cold enough to freeze the brandy in his glass, "you are the weakest of all men. Why will you not confide in me for the management of my niece? Why will you interpose? You have now undone all that I have been spending my breath to bring about." She advanced upon him, a frigate of fury, bearing down on a hap boat, while I have been endeavoring to fill her mind with maxims of prudence. You have been provoking her to reject them by your brutish methods. The squire blinked his triumph, deflating into confusion. "But I secured her. English women, brother," she continued, slicing through his stammering, "I thank heaven, are no slaves. We are not to be locked up like the Spanish and Italian wives. We have as good a right to liberty as yourselves. We are to be convinced by reason and persuasion only, and not governed by force." She drew herself up to her full imposing height. "I have seen the world, brother. I know what arguments to make use of. And if your folly had not prevented me, I should have prevailed with her to form her conduct by those rules of prudence and discretion which I formerly taught her." "To be sure," said the squire, slumping into his customary role in their exchanges. "I am always in the wrong," brother answered the lady with surgical precision. "You are not in the wrong unless when you meddle with matters beyond your knowledge. You must agree that I have seen most of the world, and happy had it been for my niece if she had not been taken from under my care. It is by living at home with you that she hath learnt these romantic notions of love and nonsense. You don't imagine, I hope, cries the squire, his temper beginning to simmer, that I have taught her any such things. Your ignorance, brother, returned, she, now reaching for her heaviest rhetorical artillery, as the great Milton says, almost subdues my patience. This was the final straw. The squire's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. D.N. Milton, he roared. If he had the impudence to say so to my face, I'd lend him a douse. If he was never so great a man. Patience. And you come to that, sister. I have more occasion of patience to be used, like an overgrown schoolboy, as I am by you. Do you think no one hath any understanding, unless he hath been about at court? His frustration, unable to be contained by the narrow channel of his original grievance, now burst its banks and flooded into the familiar plains of his political obsessions. Pox, the world is come to a fine pass indeed, if we are all fools except a parcel of Roundheads and Hanover rats. Pox, I hope the times are a-coming when we shall make fools of them, and every man shall enjoy his own. That's all, sister. And every man shall enjoy his own. I hope to see it, sister, before the Hanover rats have eat up all our corn and left us nothing but turnips to feed upon. The sibling rivalry in this story is both hilarious and telling. Who do you think has the better approach to handling Sophia? Let us know in the comments. Mrs. Western stared at him as if he had begun speaking in a forgotten dialect. His rustic, political jargon was a language she had no dictionary for. I protest, brother, she cried. You are now got beyond my understanding. Your jargon of turnips and Hanover rats is to me perfectly unintelligible. I believe, cries he, scowling, you don't care to hear home. But the country interest may succeed one day or other for all that. I wish, answered the lady, steering the conversation back to the only port that interested her, you would think a little of your daughter's interest. For believe me, she is in greater danger than the nation. Just now, said he, flustered and cornered you, chid me for thinking on her, and would ha her left to you. Seeing him on the back foot, Mrs. Western moved in for the kill. And if you will promise to interpose no more, she said, her tone shifting to one of magnanimous concession, I will, out of my regard to my niece, undertake the charge. The squire seized this escape route with the gratitude of a pardoned man. The complexities of a woman's heart were a labyrinth. He was only too happy to exit. Well, do then, said he, a wave of relief washing over him. For you know, I always agreed that women are the properest to manage women. It was his eternal convenient philosophy. Mrs. Western then departed, muttering something with an air of supreme disdain concerning the absurdity of letting men like her brother have a voice in the management of the nation when they could not even manage a single girl. She immediately repaired to Sophia's apartment, where the prisoner, after a day's confinement in the squire's crude dungeon, was now to be transferred to the more refined gilded cage of her aunt's manipulation, with Sophia back under Mrs. Western's care. What clever strategy will she employ next? Subscribe to follow the next move in this high society chess game.